This is the penultimate part of a landscape photography adventure in the Drakensberg, South Africa. In this video, after a short day of hiking, we're treated to remarkable conditions at sunset.
Hello everybody from our penultimate high camp here in the Drakensberg with the spectacular Cathedral Ridge just off to my right there. I'm really looking forward to photographing this location for just the second time. There's some fantastic foregrounds around here and we've actually just been hiding in the tents from showers that have been passing through, which obviously I'm now hoping are going to provide some photographic interest. So I'm going to show you around and hopefully find some interesting shots either to shoot this evening or tomorrow morning. So firstly, photography from right here at camp is pretty great. You can see there's a shower passing through in the distance there over that Cathedral Ridge. And I'm at 24mm here, so that gives you a sense of the width of the view. It is going to work better at moderate focal lengths, at 50mm maybe. But we do also have these lovely bushes in the foreground. And whilst these won't catch the earliest light because the sun will be rising behind that hill on the right there, they certainly would make a nice foreground at sunrise or at sunset for that matter. So there's always the doorstep option, but I think I prefer to get round this hill a little bit further just to open up the view on the ridge that little bit more.
I had planned to take you through my compositions live on the hill, but unfortunately my lav mic was playing up and it was incredibly windy, so you'll have to make do with voiceovers. And you can see that the hillside here does have some nice simple potential, but I was looking for something with a bit more perspective than you see here, a closer foreground that would really work well. So we continued on up the hill and spent some time chatting and exploring around. It was brutally windy though, and that did create some problems, not least because you're tending to search for a bit of shelter. But this was the view looking in the opposite direction, so maybe not so much to photograph in that direction, but towards the Cathedral Ridge it was really quite fantastic. And I was always looking at these kind of even foregrounds that would work fairly well, fairly simply, but ultimately I did want something more complex. But unfortunately a lot of the areas that I was exploring had a lot of broken rock, a lot of open earth, so even when I found these nice rounded bushes, unfortunately they didn't really work because the foregrounds felt a little bit disjointed somehow. And I did actually know from previous experience that there were really good foregrounds up here, but unfortunately was the operative word because it had changed quite a lot. So I actually struggled, although I did continue this very active process of trying to find compositions by changing my camera position, looking for things that were interesting, and then getting lower and further back and so on, as you can see I'm doing here. And in this clip I'm just getting a bit further away and lower down, so you can see that allows me to zoom in to form my composition. So these are the kinds of approaches that I'm taking to find my compositions, but not always successfully. And like I said, I did want a bit more perspective, and this was the foreground that I found, which amusingly turned out to be the exact composition, or very similar to the location that I'd shot some years before in November, with all of these bushes in flower and an unbelievable cloud inversion in the distance. And you can maybe pause the video and go back to that clip to see that it is actually the same spot, but the bushes had changed a lot. Some of them had grown, some of them had died, but nevertheless this was the location that I returned to when the light finally broke through the cloud and produced the most incredible golden light across the scene. So I shot an exposure bracket. The darkest exposure is here, obviously for the highlights in the sky, and then we have a middle exposure and brighter exposure, which captures all of those shadows in the foreground. And then this is the edit brought together, and I think in this case I've done a good job of managing the amazing contrast range, and I think being a little bit critical, the composition is perhaps a little bit unbalanced in the foreground. The bushes are more focused on that left hand side, but you can't always get these things perfectly right, particularly in difficult shooting conditions. And I was a bit worried about that bush on the left, which you can see just creeping in. It was actually very dark when I was stood further to the left, which is why I ended up where I did. It quickly developed into one of the most colourful sunsets I've ever seen in the Drakensberg, with all of the accompanying technical difficulties from that wind speed, but also the massive contrast and rich colour in the scene here. So I'm just going to repeat this video clip because I don't actually have any others. I spent the rest of my time trying to get a good shot of this scene, but I have edited this clip just to show you roughly what it looked like to the naked eye. And the difficulty here is getting the image as bright as possible so that a print will look good. So I did shoot an exposure bracket, and here is my darkest exposure, which shows you that rich red in the sky. But as I show you the middle exposure, you can see that red turning into orange, and by the time I show you the brightest exposure, you can see that it's yellow and white in the sky. So you see that hue shift, and that's the difficulty you have when you try to make a sky like this brighter, is that you start to lose the color, and there is no way to have your cake and eat it in this case. And this was the compromise that I arrived at, and possibly the sky is now a little bit too dark, but it's fully saturated, so there's not really much I can do to make it more colourful other than to make it darker still, which really would look weird with the foreground at the brightness that it's at. So these are incredibly hard images to edit, and you're always going to be compromising one thing or another, whether it's the brightness of the sky or the brightness of the foreground or the general sense of reality of the image. So I do like this photo, but I think I prefer the golden hour image that I just showed you, and this next image that I took just as I was walking back to camp. In fact, everybody had already made it back to camp, but I stayed on the hill a little bit later, and it was incredibly dark at this point. In fact, 5 minutes later, I needed to put my head torch on, and it was still very windy. So technically it was almost impossible to get a sharp image, and in fact I didn't quite manage to do that. This is just very slightly soft, but I did intentionally drag the shutter in this case because I loved that cloud motion in the sky, and I think it lends a sort of magical quality to the scene. And I don't often do long exposures, but in this case it was really good fun to try that, and it's a great image I think to finish on. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. It's going to be another month until I show you the final part of this trip because I will be away. But please do follow the channel if you'd like to see more. Like this video and leave me a comment. I do try to reply to all the comments, and thank you very much for watching.